Hi everyone, today we're diving into a story that starts with pride, ends with purpose, and reminds us that the line between power and powerlessness is thinner than we think. It begins with a man who once built digital empires and now wears a name tag no one bothers to read. But what happens when someone decides to see him not for what he lost, but for what he still carries? You're about to find out. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this late at night or on your lunch break or while folding laundry, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. Now let's begin. The Garden Cafe was the kind of place where jasmine spilled over the patio railings and couples took selfies with cappuccinos dusted in cinnamon. It was also where Julian Marks, 43, sat in a pressed security uniform waiting for a woman who only knew him by a first name, a phone number, and a dating profile built on carefully selected truth. He hadn't lied, not exactly. He just hadn't led with disgraced former tech mogul turned anonymous hotel guard. The sun was warm on his shoulders. The jazz trio near the fountain played something slow and forgettable. Julian adjusted his collar and glanced at the time. 2 minutes past noon. Clarissa Whitmore arrived like she owned the air around her. Blonde hair caught the breeze just enough to look unbothered. Designer sunglasses, tailored white dress, and heels that clicked like punctuation marks. She spotted him and stopped mid-stride. Her voice cracked across the patio like a dropped plate. "You're kidding me. You're the guy." Heads turned. Even the jazz paused as if the saxophone had lost its breath. Julian stood slowly. He offered a faint smile, calm and steady. "I am. And I showed up." Clarissa looked him up and down, laughter dripping with disdain. "A security guard. This is your idea of stable and successful? The agency said you were established." "I was," Julian replied. "Now I'm rebuilding." She circled slowly like she was on a reality show. "Is this a prank, a social experiment? Are there cameras? Because if I wanted charity, I'd host a fundraiser, not waste a Wednesday afternoon with a man who smells like day-old linen spray and disappointment." Her voice carried sharp as glass. Conversation stopped. A waiter froze mid-pour. A child gawked openly. Then she tossed her napkin on the table, like a judge slamming a gavel. "Enjoy your humble life, Julian, or whatever your name really is." Her heels echoed as she walked away. It was the sound of judgment, perfectly timed and painfully final. Julian sat back down, hands still gazed forward. He didn't reach for his water, didn't check his phone. He just breathed, shallow at first, then deeper. That's when he noticed the woman nearby. She had been standing off to the side with a tray of clean glasses, petite chestnut hair pulled into a bun apron, dusted with flour near the hem. She was watching him, not like the others with pity or glee, but with concern. "Sir," she asked gently. Her voice didn't break the silence. It softened it. "Are you okay?" Julian looked up. "I've seen worse." She nodded once, her eyes thoughtful. "Still, sorry you had to go through that. We all were. But you handled it better than most." He gave a faint smile. "At least she didn't throw her drink." The woman chuckled. "Give her time." He blinked, surprised by the warmth in that small laugh. She hesitated, then asked, "Would you like a fresh cup of coffee?" "It's on me. You don't have to." "I know," she said, cutting him off gently. "But I want to." She returned minutes later with a ceramic mug and a little cream pitcher. No bill, no fanfare. She set it down, and then instead of walking away, she sat across from him. Not as a waitress, not as a stranger, as someone willing to sit with a man the world had just passed judgment on. "I'm Danielle," she said. "Julian," he replied. "Nice to meet you." "You really lost your company?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said, "and still showed up. A promise is still a promise." Danielle stirred her own coffee. "Then I'd say you've already got more integrity than most of the men who walk in here in suits." For the first time that day, Julian laughed, a soft, real, almost startled laugh. And as the hum of conversation crept back into the air and the jazz resumed, something shifted. Danielle still had tables to serve guests to check on. But before she left, she paused and slid a napkin toward him with a phone number scribbled in blue ink. "If you ever want to not talk about business failures over good pie and bad jukebox music, I know a place." He looked down at the napkin, then back up at her. You just gave your number to a guy who was publicly humiliated. Danielle smirked. Figured you could handle humble packaging. She walked off, apron swishing behind her, and Julian sat in the same spot for 10 more minutes watching, listening, blinking slower than usual. That night in his modest rented room off King Street, Julian sat at his kitchen table, flipping that napkin over and over. His phone buzzed. It was Nora, his old assistant. So she said, how'd it go? She left after 5 minutes, he replied. She called me pathetic, a liar, and smelled like I just wrestled with regret. Sounds about right, Nora said. And then something happened, Julian said slowly. Someone saw me. He told her about Danielle, the coffee, the calm. Nora was quiet. You think she recognized you? No, Julian said. She didn't fake her kindness. She didn't flinch. You think she's worth it? I think I'd rather find out than keep pretending I'm okay in the silence. There was a pause. Well, Nora said, if it becomes real, tell her everything. No masks, no mystery. I know, he said. And as he stared out the window at the city below, at the glowing signs, cracked sidewalks, and bike trails drawn in chalk by children, he didn't know, he thought maybe this fall isn't the end. Maybe it's the beginning. Julian didn't text Danielle that night. He waited until morning, standing outside the hotel where he worked the early shift. The Charleston sky was just turning pink, and the scent of salt and magnolia clung to the damp air. His thumbs hovered over his screen for a second too long before finally tapping. If that pie place still has open seats, I'd like to try the bad jukebox, she replied 10 minutes later. Friday night. 6:30. Dress code is you tried. By the time Friday came, Julian had second-guessed everything from his shoes to the sincerity of her invitation. But when he walked into the little pie shop on the corner of Meeting and Amherst, he knew he'd made the right call. It was small, cluttered, and smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. A jukebox in the back warbled out an old Al Green tune. Danielle was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of coffee and flipping through a paint-smeared sketchbook. She looked up and smiled. You clean up nice. Julian sat down, smiling back. You look like sunshine and rebellion. She raised an eyebrow. That's a new one. They ordered 2 slices of apple pie, extra whipped cream, on hers black coffee for him. Conversation came easily, too easily for someone who hadn't trusted another human being in over a year. They talked about childhood books, about street performers in New Orleans, about the time Danielle tried to train her cat to walk on a leash and ended up getting chased by it instead. She asked nothing about his past. She never once brought up the Garden Cafe. But halfway through the second slice, Julian cleared his throat. I want to tell you something, he said. Danielle set her fork down, attentive but not afraid. Okay, I wasn't always a security guard, he began, his eyes fixed on the Formica table. I used to run a tech company in Atlanta. Mark's Logic. It got big. Too big. My fiance and my CFO, same person, actually, they stole everything I built and pinned the breach on me. Danielle didn't blink. She didn't rush to fill the silence either. I walked away before they could bury me in a courtroom, Julian said. Started over here. Took a name tag and a key card instead of suits and shareholders. She took a slow sip of coffee. That's a lot. Yeah, but you told me. That means more than whatever titles you had. He looked at her, the first flicker of surprise in his expression. You're not freaked out. I'm a waitress in a city where half the guests pretend I don't exist unless their water's empty. You think a fallen CEO scares me? Julian exhaled like he'd been holding it in for months. You know, she continued, if you ever want to build something again, not for money but for purpose, I might have an idea. And that's how New Roots Studio was born. They started small. Danielle had been running weekend paint sessions at a local rec center, using leftover supplies and borrowed easels. She had dreams of something permanent, a community art and mentorship space where kids could express, heal, and grow. But what she didn't have was a blueprint, or backing, or anyone who knew how to speak to donors. Julian, on the other hand, had spent years building logistics pipelines and running presentations in glass towers. He may not have a company anymore, but he still knew how to make things real. Their roles formed naturally. Danielle was the heart, the vision. Julian was the bones, the foundation. They spent late nights designing the layout, pricing paints, calling old contacts. Some doors stayed closed, some opened but cautiously, and some surprisingly swung wide with support. Julian reached out to Cal Briggs, an old friend and former Marine who now ran a private security consultancy. Cal wasn't just muscle, he was loyalty in boots. "You finally decided to stop hiding," Cal said when they met. "Not just for me," Julian replied, "for something bigger." Within weeks, they secured a location, a shuttered daycare building near Liberty Hill with bright windows and chipped tiles. Danielle cried when they signed the lease. Julian pretended not to notice and asked about paint samples instead. Word started spreading. Local parents volunteered to help repaint walls. A retired art teacher donated brushes. Even the owner of the pie shop showed up with a crock pot full of chili on moving day. And just like that, the dream began to breathe. But not everyone welcomed the rebirth. Clarissa Whitmore, still nestled comfortably in Charleston's social elite, caught wind of Julian's reemergence through whispers and boardroom gossip. She had laughed off their awkward blind date, chalked him up to a con artist with nice posture. But now he was gaining influence again, this time through heart-not headlines. At a charity gala hosted by her father's foundation, she cornered a donor who had just pledged funds to New Roots. "You're backing that?" she scoffed. "Julian Marks is a fraud. He's pretending to be noble because he lost the big game." The donor laughed politely, then excused himself. Clarissa's eyes narrowed. She didn't like being ignored. Back at New Roots, the walls were now lined with children's drawings. Dinosaurs, rainbows, portraits of moms. Julian and Danielle kept their heads down and their hands busy. Paint-stained fingers shared lunches, late-night plans. One afternoon, as they sat on the front steps watching kids run through the courtyard, Julian turned to her. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not seeing me the way the world did." Danielle leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's the only way I know how to see." And for the first time in a very long time, Julian Marks believed he wasn't just starting over, he was building forward. The morning light filtered through the wide front windows of New Roots Studio, casting long bands of gold across half-finished canvases and scattered sketch pads. The building, once silent and forgotten, now buzzed with life kids laughing in the back room, a volunteer adjusting paint jars by color gradient, and the smell of fresh brewed coffee always drifting from the kitchen. Julian stood near the front door with a clipboard in hand, ticking through the last items for the upcoming donor preview. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves and a smear of turquoise paint decorated the back of his wrist, a relic from helping one of the students finish a mural of a city skyline. Across the room, Danielle was gently correcting a boy's brushstroke. She didn't raise her voice, didn't use condescending tones. She spoke like someone who remembered what it felt like to be overlooked. Julian watched her and thought not for the first time that this place only breathed because she was in it. But good things rarely grow without challenge. Later that afternoon, Julian received an email flagged as urgent. It was from their supplier canvas, and easel shipments had been paused due to a billing discrepancy. Confused, he called their contact directly. The woman on the phone sounded apologetic but firm. "I was told to put a freeze on your account. Someone from your board reached out, said your financials were under review." Julian's pulse quickened. He hadn't authorized any review. He immediately called Cal Briggs. Within the hour, Cal arrived with a worn leather folder and a face that meant business. "Someone's been feeding info to an outsider," Cal said, spreading out printed emails and server logs. "Nothing explosive yet, but enough to spook vendors." Julian scanned the documents. One name jumped out: Derek Ames. Longtime associate, one of the original board members, former CFO of a nonprofit in Savannah. "Derek's been with us from the start," Julian said, eyes narrowing. Cal grunted. "Exactly," which made it easy for him to leak documents without raising suspicion. "I ran a parallel search. Every breach came from his account." Danielle, who had joined them mid-conversation, paled. "Why would he do that?" Cal shrugged. "Money, leverage, pride. Or maybe someone offered him a ladder out." That's when it clicked. Clarissa. She'd always played long games. She didn't just want Julian to fail, she wanted to make sure he couldn't stand up again. And Derek, with his access and insecurities, was the perfect pawn. Julian stood up. "We can't confront him yet, not without proof that'll hold." "Already on it," Cal said, tapping his phone. "We're setting up a surveillance meet, one move at a time. In the meantime, they couldn't let the studio falter. Julian and Danielle put in double shifts calling donors, hand-delivering letters, coordinating supplies from local hardware stores when vendors backed out. Volunteers rallied. Parents showed up to paint walls. A retired carpenter fixed a jammed window on his lunch break. Still, something weighed heavy on the atmosphere. Clarissa wasn't quiet. She started planting stories, quiet ones slipped through social circles and cocktail hours, that Julian was using the studio to launder reputation, that Danielle was a manipulative face of emotional bait, that New Roots wasn't sustainable. But the worst came one Sunday evening when Julian and Danielle attended a networking event at a waterfront gallery. Clarissa made her entrance mid-speech all gleam and gloss. When Julian stepped away to speak with a city council liaison, Clarissa approached Danielle, cocktail glass in hand, smile sharp as a blade. "Well, well," she said, eyes scanning Danielle's simple navy dress. "I have to say you clean up better than I expected." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Is this how you greet everyone you've publicly humiliated?" Clarissa laughed lightly. "Oh, I don't remember you being at the cafe." "I wasn't seated, but I saw everything." Clarissa tilted her head. "Then I suppose you've chosen your role well. Every king needs a loyal servant girl to dust off his crown." Danielle didn't blink. "And some heiresses need to be reminded that kindness doesn't come with a price tag." Clarissa's eyes flashed, but before she could retort, Julian returned. He caught the end of the exchange, enough to read the tension in Danielle's shoulders. "Clarissa," he said coolly, "you've always known how to dress a threat in silk." She smiled sweetly. "And you've always been drawn to peasant revolts." "Funny," Julian said, "because revolutions are what build legacies." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clarissa walked away without another word. Back at the studio that night, Julian found Danielle standing in the mural room alone. The lights were dim, and her hands were wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I didn't realize how much power someone like her still had." "She has reached," Julian said softly, "but not the roots." Danielle turned to him, eyes glinting with something stronger than fear. "Then let's grow deeper." That week, Cal and his tech team finalized the surveillance setup. A staged meeting was arranged. Julian invited Derek to discuss possible succession planning. Derek arrived smug, confident, and already calculating. Over coffee in the office, Julian casually asked if Derek wanted to take on a larger role. "If something happened to me, the board would need a clear head. You've been here since the beginning." Derek leaned forward. "That's generous. And yes, I'd want more oversight, especially over donor access and financial logistics." He smiled like a man who thought he'd already won. It was all recorded, audio, video, time-stamped. The next day, Julian called an emergency board meeting. He presented the footage, the emails, the leaks. Silence. No one defended Derek. No one tried to spin it. He was removed by unanimous vote. And Clarissa. She didn't deny it, but she didn't speak publicly again either. New Roots Studio stood, shaken but not broken. And that night after the staff left, Julian and Danielle sat beneath the glow of string lights strung across the back patio. It was quiet, just the two of them, the scent of paint still lingering, and the murmur of hope refusing to die. Danielle reached across the table, took Julian's hand and whispered, This is what justice looks like." Julian squeezed back. "And you're the reason I didn't run again." The stars above them didn't speak, but their silence felt like a blessing. 3 days later, the New Roots studio was abuzz with quiet purpose. Children's paintings lined the walls like patchwork banners of resilience. Volunteers moved like clockwork. It was the day of the official opening gala, a moment Julian had dreamed of, not as a redemption arc for himself, but as a launchpad for a new generation of voices too long ignored. Yet as the sun began to dip over Charleston's skyline, casting long amber shadows across the community center parking lot, Julian stood alone in his office. He wore a simple charcoal suit, clean lines, no tie. His fingers trembled slightly as he smoothed the lapels. On his desk was a folded speech and an envelope marked with Clarissa Whitmore's seal. She hadn't attended the gala, not officially, but her fingerprints were all over the whispers that had dogged the press in the days leading up to it. Words like image grab, rebrand, and sham philanthropy had shown up on local blogs. Nothing directly traceable, of course. Clarissa always played just far enough behind the curtain. Still, Julian had made a decision. He stepped out of his office into the polished corridor of the newly renovated studio. Guests were already arriving, local business leaders, journalists, parents with eager children in tow. Light music floated from the main room. The aroma of baked goods donated by neighborhood bakeries danced with the smell of fresh paint. Danielle stood near the door greeting visitors. She wore a green dress with a sunflower pin on the strap. When she saw Julian, her expression shifted, not nervous, not excited. Steady, anchoring. She walked up to him and took his hand. "You ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." The crowd gathered in the main hall beneath a handmade banner that read, "New Roots Where Every Story Begins." Julian stepped onto the small platform that doubled as the studio's performance stage. The buzz of conversation dimmed to a soft hush. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he began, voice measured sure. "This center, these walls, these brushes, these voices, they are not about me. But there is something I need to say." He paused, looking out over the crowd. Danielle stood near the back, her hands clasped in front of her. "For a long time, I believed power was something you held in your hands. Money, status, applause. But I lost all of that. And in the silence that followed, I found something better. A reason." He glanced at the folded paper in his hand, then set it aside. "I was once the CEO of a tech firm called Mark's Logic. I lost it all: my company, my reputation, my trust in people. I ran. I hid behind a name tag and a uniform, hoping the world would forget me before I forgot myself." Gasps murmured through the room. Cameras clicked, eyes widened. "And then one day I was humiliated on a blind date, in public, loudly. But someone saw me, not the version of me I used to project. The real me, the broken me. Her name was Danielle." He looked directly at her. "She didn't ask what I used to own. She offered coffee, and that changed everything." Danielle blinked slowly. Her shoulders rose and fell with quiet grace. "I tell you this not for pity or praise. I tell you because justice doesn't begin in courtrooms or headlines. It begins when people choose truth over image. When someone says, 'I see you,' and they mean it." The audience had gone completely still. This center was not built with power. It was built with purpose. With pie shop conversations, scraped knees, late-night phone calls, and donations that came with handwritten notes. It was built by people who believe a second chance is not a weakness, it's a responsibility. He stepped down from the stage as the room erupted in applause, not wild or frenzied, but heartfelt. A rising warmth that filled the space like sunlight after a storm. After the ceremony, guests lingered. Children ran through the hallway, laughing, chasing bubbles someone had released from the back patio. Danielle stayed near Julian's side as parents and donors offered quiet words of support. A few reporters tried to sneak in direct questions about Clarissa. Julian simply smiled and said, "That story's already behind me." But outside, near the edge of the crowd, he spotted her. Clarissa Whitmore, dressed in slate gray arms, crossed lips drawn into a smirk too small for comfort. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood another board member. Julian recognized Richard Denning, a man known for following money like a weather vane. Danielle followed Julian's gaze. "She's still watching always," he murmured. "But so are we." They didn't approach her. They didn't need to. Later that night, long after the last guest had gone, and the string lights on the back patio were dimmed to a soft glow, Julian and Danielle sat together on a bench in the studio's small garden courtyard. Crickets chirped in the bushes. A half-finished mosaic shimmered under moonlight. "She'll keep coming," Julian said. "Clarissa doesn't quit." "No," Danielle replied. "But neither do we." He smiled. "You know, when I first sat down at that cafe, I thought my life had collapsed. I never imagined it would unfold." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Turns out collapse and unfolding can look a lot alike." He turned to her, then pulled something small from his jacket pocket. A box. She sat up slightly, eyes narrowing in quiet surprise. "Before you say anything," he said softly, "this isn't about the moment. It's about all the ones that got us here." He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring, modest, unflashy, but engraved with a phrase she instantly recognized: "You believe first." Danielle didn't speak at first. She just stared at the words, then at him. "I'm not asking for fairy tales," Julian said. "Just for something real, something we keep choosing." She reached out, touched the ring, and then his cheek. "Yes," she whispered. "Every day, yes." The wind rustled through the garden. Somewhere inside the studio, a wind chime jingled faintly. And for the first time since the world had stripped him bare, Julian Marks no longer felt like a man trying to rebuild himself. He felt like a man finally becoming who he was always meant to be. In the weeks that followed, New Roots Studio flourished not just as a place but as a presence, a heartbeat, a refuge. The mural walls expanded with stories from children who once hesitated to speak. The afternoon painting sessions grew from 5 kids to 20. Local artists offered free mentorship. A small garden planted with wildflowers and hope began blooming near the back fence. Julian and Danielle found a rhythm. Mornings began with unlocking doors and brewing coffee. Afternoons were spent reviewing grant applications, fixing loose stools, and really listening to the heartbeat of their growing community. But not all attention was welcome. Clarissa's final play came through back channels. She wasn't reckless, she was precise. A new nonprofit popped up overnight on the other side of town, Whitmore Arts Collective. It was glossy corporate and loudly positioned as the premier youth arts initiative of Charleston. She siphoned 3 of the original foundation board members with promises of funding, prestige, and visibility. When Julian opened an email one morning and saw their resignations, 2 sentences each, clean and cold, he felt a familiar burn behind his ribs. He took the elevator to the rooftop garden. Danielle was already there, her shoes kicked off, sipping from a chipped mug. "They're gone," he said. "Martin, Elise, and Heather, all 3. Danielle didn't look surprised. She offered them something shinier. "I thought we were past this." She tilted her head, thoughtful. "Maybe we're just deeper in it." Julian sat beside her, knees bent, jacket unbuttoned. "I'm tired, Danielle. Not of the work, of always having to prove we're real." She reached over and laced her fingers with his. "Then stop proving. Just be. Those who see it will, and those who don't never mattered." 2 days later came the surprise. A sleek black SUV pulled into the lot of New Roots just after 11 a.m. Out stepped a tall man with silver temples and a quiet gait. Julian recognized him instantly, Harold Brennan, CEO of one of the largest logistics firms on the East Coast. He was accompanied by his assistant and a man in a wheelchair. Julian walked out to greet them, heartbeat ticking in his ears. The man in the chair raised a hand and smiled. Julian blinked in recognition. "Paul Kendrick," the man said. "You funded the shelter where I lived 3 winters ago. Back when everyone else saw me as a cautionary tale." Julian nodded, stunned. "You remembered I remember people who see me," Paul replied. "And I hear you've been doing a lot more of that." Harold stepped forward. "We'd like to offer full logistics and supply support for New Roots nationwide. We believe in scaling something with soul." Danielle had come outside, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped in her tracks as Harold handed Julian a signed agreement. The air buzzed, but not with nerves, with promise. That night, under paper lanterns and laughter from the neighborhood's children, Julian stood on the main stage for the closing ceremony of New Roots Expansion Festival. He didn't need a microphone. The people leaned in. "I used to believe legacy came from what you leave behind," he said. "But now I know. It's about who you bring forward with you." He looked at Danielle, her eyes shimmering beneath the string lights. "Everything here began with a moment of humiliation. But what I found after was not revenge. It was dignity. Because one woman offered coffee instead of judgment. People clapped. Some wiped away tears. But Danielle, she just smiled. Because she knew." As the sun disappeared and the guests drifted home, Julian and Danielle stayed behind, sitting on the back steps of the studio in the cool hush of evening. She rested her head on his shoulder. "You think she'll stop now?" Danielle asked. Julian watched the distant headlights rolling through the street. "No," he said quietly, "but neither will we." A week later, while sorting through a stack of grant letters in the break room, Danielle found something wedged between envelopes. A note in gold-embossed stationery. "You don't belong in this world anymore. Walk away or we'll drag you. No signature. No return address." She brought it straight to Julian. I recognized the language she said. It's not just her anymore. She has allies. Julian stared at the words for a long time, then slid the note into a drawer and locked it. We don't respond with panic, he said. We respond with purpose. He called Cal Briggs the same day. Security cameras were checked. Doors were reinforced. Staff were briefed. No fear-mongering, just readiness. But the next move came not through threats, but through whispers. News stations picked up rumors of a power struggle behind the scenes at New Roots. Anonymous sources claimed that Julian had manipulated donors, that the studio was a vanity project masking old ambitions. One outlet even aired footage from the Garden Cafe blind date, dug up from someone's cell phone cut and edited to paint Julian as a failed fraud, desperate for attention. Danielle turned off the TV halfway through the segment. Julian sat at the edge of the bed, quiet. Worn. We knew it might come, she said. He nodded. So what? Now Julian stood, pulled on his coat, and opened the notebook he kept on the corner shelf, the same one where he had once written her name for the first time. He added one line. We tell the truth. Publicly. Completely. 2 days later, they invited every donor, every community partner, every volunteer to a gathering in the main hall. Press was allowed in. No spin, no lawyers. Julian stood at the front of the room, Danielle beside him, and said, if I ever made a mistake, it was hiding behind a uniform because I believed the world wouldn't accept who I was. But the people in this room proved otherwise. You gave grace. You gave time. You gave belief. And I will not repay that with silence. He then read the threatening letter aloud. He showed emails from Clarissa's allies. He presented facts, names, dates, documents, truth, not vengeance, transparency. At the end, he said, we don't fight power with shame. We fight it by building something it can't dismantle. The applause came slowly at first. Then it roared in Clarissa. She stayed silent because now everyone saw her, and Julian Marks was no longer just a man who had once fallen. He was a man who refused to stay down. Sometimes life doesn't break all at once. It unravels quietly. A betrayal here, a cruel word there, an identity you thought would last crumbling under the weight of someone else's lies. That's what happened to Julian Marks. And maybe in some way it's happened to you too. Maybe you've had a season when everything you built seemed to vanish in a moment, when all that remained was your word and whether you'd keep it. But here's the thing about collapse, it's not the end. Sometimes it's just the space needed for something better to rise. Julian found his redemption not in regaining power, but in letting go of the need to impress anyone. He found love not in the polished woman who mocked his downfall, but in the waitress who saw past the surface and offered him a cup of coffee without expecting anything in return. That's justice in real life. Not loud, not always legal, but deeply, quietly transformative. So if you're in a season of silence, if you're wondering whether you're seen, whether you're worth rebuilding this story as your reminder you are, and if you're lucky, someone like Danielle Hayes might show up in your world offering grace where others offer judgment. And if you're brave, you might become that someone for someone else. Because justice doesn't always wear robes or walk into courtrooms. Sometimes it wears an apron, sometimes it speaks softly over pie, and sometimes it hands you a ring engraved with 4 simple words you believe first.